Welcome to the next in my series of studies in John's Gospel. Lots of times people ask whether we can prove there's a God. Kath and I did a whole questions of life on whether we can be sure or not. And we talked about the probabilities of there being a God. I like the story of the man who in anger and anguish and desperation for God to prove himself to him, went to the top of a hill and cried out to God and said, "God, if you're there, speak to me." You probably know the story. The story goes that he heard a bird sing beautifully in the trees. But in his anger, he said, "God, I can't hear you. God, speak to me." And he heard the joyful noise of children playing in the valley below, laughter and fun. But he was still angry. And he said, "God, I can't hear you. Say something to me. Touch me." And the wind blew gently, caressed his forehead. "God, it's no good. I can't hear you. I want to see you. Show me something. Show me that you're there." And the story goes that a butterfly came and alighted upon him. "God, I need to know your love." And in desperation, he returned home, disappointed, fed up, and angry. "God, I need to know your love." And he was welcomed by a child, his daughter, who came in and greeted him and threw her arms around him and gave him a hug. "Daddy, Daddy." And he went away angry with God. Sometimes proof is there right in our very eyes, but we don't see it because we're looking for something else. Or perhaps we don't want to see it. I like to think that the universe points to the presence and nature of God, that just our very life is a miracle in itself, and yet others can't see it. They want a sign. Well, Jesus is asked for proof in the part of the Bible that we're going to look at now. The story takes place in John chapter 2. There has been a wedding at Cana, and at the end of the wedding, where Jesus has turned water into wine, John the writer says this: "What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him." So what is this sign? Well, we looked at it when we did this talk just 2 or 3 sessions ago, but just to recap if you're just joining this series now. There were 3 main things that I drew out that the disciples recognized as a signpost that Jesus was significant and doing something different. And the first was around this whole thing of turning the water into wine. And the symbolism of wine was of joy and celebration. And by turning water into wine, he was saying, "I'm now bringing the joy of God's presence." And he helps a family who probably through financial reasons, probably were poorer members of the community, were embarrassed to have run out of wine. And Mary says quietly, "Can you do something about this?" Because she has compassion. And so the second signpost is that God helps the poor and the ashamed. And the wine that he creates is the best wine that they've ever drunk. So he does more than is deserved or expected. And it says that the disciples put their faith in him. And we explored that in one of our previous talks. And in our last talk, we began the story by looking at what happened next, where Jesus goes to the temple and he drives out those who are exploiting and obscuring God. And we read about the fact that the disciples recognized that he had zeal and energy and passion for the presence of God, for the house of God. And if you don't want a reminder of where we were, because we're going to pick this up, that Jesus identifies probably 4 things that he was so angry about. The first was that they had engaged in an insincere ritual rather than a true heart response. Instead of coming with their offering prepared, they were buying something in the temple courts. It wasn't something they'd thought about. It was just, "Here, give me the nearest animal to sacrifice." It wasn't something from the heart. It was something that was ritualistic and insincere. And this buying and selling was taking place in the place that God had reserved for those who were not yet of the Jewish culture and faith to come and pray. It was the court of the Gentiles, the foreigners. And so the second thing that made Jesus angry probably was that they were pushing away people of a different race or culture. And they were obscuring God from others. And then in exchanging the money which they needed to do in order to be able to use the money in the Roman town, in the Roman occupied Jerusalem, they were doing that before they worshipped. They were putting financial expediency before real worship. And they were probably charging the poor more and exploiting and extorting. And so he drives them out. He takes a whip, not a whip to hurt people, but a whip to control the animals. And we looked at all of this in our last session. He drives them out. And we pick it up in John 2, verse 18. The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" Now that seems a reasonable question, and on the face of it is a reasonable question. How do we decide whether a person has authority? I tend to think that authority lies in one of two areas. The first authority, and the best authority, it lies in the truth of someone's words. In other words, you may or may not think that my teaching is authoritative. And actually that boils down to whether you think what I say is truth or not. So the authority of a person lies from their integrity, their credibility. It comes from who they are. And this clearly was what the disciples had already decided. They had decided from the way Jesus had acted in Cana, the way he cared for the poor family, the way he had used wine as a symbol of God's joyful presence. They had decided that his words were truthful, and therefore they would put their trust in him. Therefore they saw that he had authority. Sometimes people want a uniform, or they want a job title, or they want a qualification to give themselves authority. And I always feel real authority comes from the integrity of what is said, not from a title, not from a uniform, not from something on the office door. But there is a place where authority is derived because it's given to us by a higher authority. In other words, that the authority comes because of who has given it. Now, this may apply to the police, where they have authority because that authority has been given to them by the Queen, by the government, by the courts of law. So their authority lies in who has, who is behind them, who is invested in them, who has chosen them, who has appointed them. So authority comes in two areas. First authority is the quality of what's said. The second authority is by higher appointment. And for the disciples, as we've already said, the authority in Jesus simply came from what he said. They didn't need another sign. They saw the wedding in Cana as their sign. But those who were asking this question didn't like what Jesus had done. Now, I suspect the disciples were beginning to understand what Jesus was doing. And so they probably, when he drove out the money lenders and he drove out those who were selling sacrifices, they probably trusted him. And they maybe began to see what he was doing. And maybe they were uncomfortable with the commercialism and the exploitation that was going on. But there were people there who loved what was going on because they were making money out of it. And so they want to know who's behind Jesus. So they say, prove your authority to do all of this. And by not accepting and understanding the value of what he's done, they're already showing that they're slightly against him. And then Jesus says something very enigmatic. Verse 19 of John 2. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." Now, what does he mean? Well, he's really implying, as something that was clear throughout the Old Testament and again in the New Testament, that the temple is shorthand for the dwelling of God, the place where God is. And so he is saying to them, you will destroy the presence of God, and 3 days later the presence of God will rise again. So he's deliberately being provocative to them. They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" And John tells us the explanation. In verse 21, "But the temple he had spoken of was his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said." This is John 2:22. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So Jesus is saying to those who are questioning him, my authority will be my resurrection. My authority will be that you will put me to death and I will rise again. So the resurrection is the proof for those who are not moved by his words. In other words, for those who haven't already accepted his authority because they look at Jesus and say, "You're an incredible guy and we want to follow you." For those, then the resurrection is there. But we need to be honest and say that for many people, the resurrection is rejected. I want to pause for a moment of question and reflection and just ask ourselves this question. What is it that Jesus might say or do that makes us feel confident in his authority? What are the words of life that he has shown us, that we've read or that we've received, that give us a confidence to trust Jesus? Because that's the best way of having a faith in him. Is it his words of love or compassion? "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. I am the vine, you are the gardener." So resurrection is a proof for those who can't get and understand his words. But there are also those of us who, through life's pain and suffering and conflict and disappointment in God, that we need maybe at times the proof of the resurrection. We say, "God, where are you? My prayer hasn't been answered. I've experienced persecution or suffering or ill health or disappointment or bereavement. Where are you, God?" And again, the resurrection comes in as proof for us. So how can the resurrection be proof for us today, 2,000 years later? How is it that we're still talking about Jesus? It seems to me that ideas last for two reasons. So the idea that Jesus rose from the dead and still be talked about here amongst us in the 21st century, it can only be for two reasons. An idea will only last for 2,000 years for one of two reasons. The first reason is because it's true. And the second reason is because it's enforced with fear or a bribe or a threat. Christianity begins for 300 years with no violence, no threats, no financial gain, no armies, no power, just persecution. And so we can argue that for Christianity to survive those first 300 years of being fed to the lions and the gladiators and persecuted, we can argue that it must have been true because nobody was telling anybody to be a Christian or else. I know that happened later in Christian history and that damaged the church rather than helped it grow. A Christian thinker, Christian Barker, says this, and he's speaking of the resurrection. He says, "I was not there to see it any more than I was awake to see the sun rise this morning. But I affirm it as surely as I do that by God's grace the sun did rise this morning, because that is why the world is flooded with light." I'm with Frederick. I didn't see the sun rise this morning. I very, 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 very rarely see the sunrise, probably a few times in my life, but I can see the light. We weren't there to see Jesus rise from the dead, but we can see the light that it has caused down, shed down through history since then. Because you see, the resurrection is the only explanation for there to be Christians by the year 312, and I'll explain 312 in a minute. There's no other explanation as to how the church survived, because there were many other faiths and religions, some that had other resurrection stories, some that had other incredible births, but they all died by the wayside because they were copies of something, whereas Christianity was true. And when we think about some of the other religions and ideas that have lasted for thousands of years, we may want to ask ourselves, how much was force or fear involved? Because there was nothing like that for the first 300 years of Christianity. In 312, the Roman emperor became a Christian, and a bit by bit, then it became a bit different, and the church, instead of being a persecuted minority, became allied to the power. And so for the next 1,000 years, there was coercion, there was corruption, and Christianity was discredited. But again, it survived. It survived in spite of it being widely seen as being tainted. Why did it survive? Because there was a true underbelly of Christianity that was peaceful and not power-grabbing, that wasn't about money and prestige. And really, the church ought to have died like all the other corrupt practices of the Middle Ages. But it didn't, because it was true. And today around the world, there are Christians who are still persecuted. There are Christians in countries where it's illegal to follow Jesus. Why doesn't Christianity die out? Great atheist Soviet Union empire tried to eliminate Christianity, as had other communist or countries allied to other faiths. But it hasn't. So we can trust and believe in the resurrection, because there's no other explanation. Jesus says the proof will be that I will die and arise again. And that leads me on to another question that I want to just explore for a few moments before we conclude. It may not be a question that you ask, but it's one that I ask. Why is the sign the resurrection? Why doesn't he, I don't know, make everybody float 20, 30 feet off the ground and hover there? Why isn't the miracle some dramatic moving of Jerusalem to England, something cosmic? Why is the miracle the proof, the sign of God, not some undoubted miracle of strength and power and glory? I think the death and resurrection of Jesus as the sign of his authority is really important and symbolic, and I want to suggest 3 reasons. Firstly, because it points to death being defeated, and that any other miraculous proof misses the point. The point is that, yes, you and I are going to die, but it's not the end. So the resurrection is the sign of God's defeat of death. And the second thing is that the cross and the resurrection indicate that suffering is not going to be avoided. It's going to be overcome. In other words, that Jesus is saying, I want you to understand that the way of following me is not some miraculous avoidance of trouble, but going through difficulty. I've got my dog here. I don't know whether she's in shot and distracting, but she stopped snoring, so that's a good thing. And we'll carry on. Jesus is clear that the resurrection is a sign of who he is, because it demonstrates his style and his manner, which leads us into the third element of understanding what the resurrection is a sign of. It is that the way of Jesus is through apparent defeat. The way of Jesus is through something that looks like failure. The way of Jesus is Jesus on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The way of Jesus is grace. The way of Jesus is humility. He's not lording it over. He's not proving. And we go back to that story at the beginning about the man crying out to God, God, why don't you prove yourself in some dramatic way? Because that isn't the nature of God. He gently gives us the choice to follow him. He makes himself available, but he doesn't force himself. And the resurrection and the cross is the sign of God, because it's the sign that love triumphs over difficulty, and that grace and mercy is the way of Jesus. N.T. Wright, the great bishop and theologian of today, says the message of the resurrection is that this world matters, that the injustices and pains of this present world must now be addressed with the news that healing, justice, and love have won. If Easter means Jesus Christ is only raised in a spiritual sense, then it is only about me and finding a new dimension to my personal life. But if Jesus Christ is truly raised from the dead, Christianity becomes good news for the whole world, news which warms our hearts precisely because it isn't just about warming hearts. Easter means that in a world where injustice, violence, and degradation are endemic, God is not prepared to tolerate such things, and that we will work and plan with all the energy of God to implement the victory of Jesus over them all. So our next question, our final question is this: how does the resurrection inspire us? How is it a sign of the nature and power of God that causes us to say, yes, Lord, I want to follow you? That causes us to say, we believe in your authority. Are we people of resurrection and people of the cross, people who triumph over adversity rather than want some dramatic avoidance of it? I want to lead us in a prayer from the prayer book Gathering for Worship. Almighty God, through the raising of your Son from the grave, you broke the power of death and condemned death itself to die. As we celebrate this great triumph, may we also make it a model for our living. Help us to identify in our lives all that should rightly die: redundant relationships, tired habits, and fruitless longings. Resurrect in our lives faith, hope, and love, as surely as you raised Jesus Christ from the grave. Amen. What words of Jesus have authority for us? How does the resurrection inspire us?